They painted me as a thief, said I betrayed my own mother, my own blood, for money. My sister's accusation cost me everything: my home, my reputation, 10 years of my life. Everyone believed the lie she told. But there was one secret she thought was buried forever, and I was coming back to unearth it. Before the storm, there was Oakhaven, a town where Americans' names are common names in the United States, where the scent of old books and blooming roses mingled in the air I breathed. My life was a quiet melody played out in the aisles of the Oakhaven Public Library, where I was Charlotte Vance, the town librarian, a woman known for her gentle voice and her precise cataloging of stories and dreams. My own dreams were modest, woven with the threads of a future I'd often discussed with my mother, Agnes. We'd sit on her porch sipping tea, and she'd listen with a soft smile as I described the little literary cafe I hoped to open one day, a cozy haven of coffee and words. She'd even set aside a small portion of her savings, her dream fund for me, she called it. Life felt ordered, kind, and my reputation was as untarnished as a newly polished silver teaspoon. Then, Mother Agnes passed. The grief was a heavy cloak, but beneath it there was the warmth of shared memories, the echo of her laughter in the rooms of our family home, a home that was supposed to be a sanctuary for both my sister, Brenda, and me. The day of the will reading arrived, somber and gray, much like the mood in Mr. Thompson's stuffy law office. I remember Brenda sitting beside me, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a picture of sorrow. I reached for her hand, a silent offering of comfort. Thinking we would navigate this loss together, as sisters should, I had no inkling that the ground beneath my feet was about to split open, swallowing a Karen, or any other person, whole. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, his words formal and detached, until he reached the part about Mother's personal assets, her modest savings, her cherished jewelry, a few valuable antiques she'd inherited. And then, Brenda's voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the quiet. She stood up, her face a mask of practiced outrage, and said to Mr. Thompson, loud enough for the entire room and seemingly the entire town to hear, that there was a significant discrepancy. She accused me, her sister, of systematically siphoning off Mother's assets both before and after her death. She claimed thousands in cash were gone, along with Mother's diamond engagement ring and a collection of antique porcelain dolls. The air in the room turned to ice. I just stared, my mind a blank, a roaring in my ears. My sister? My own sister.
The immediate aftermath was a blur of disbelief and a rapidly escalating nightmare. Brenda, fueled by a righteousness that seemed to convince everyone, insisted I leave the family home immediately. She said she couldn't bear to live under the same roof as a thief who had betrayed our mother's trust. Mr. Thompson, who had known our family for decades, merely looked down at his papers, offering no defense, no question, just a quiet suggestion that perhaps it would be best if I found alternative accommodation. That was the first stab of betrayal from the outside world. The first confirmation that Brenda's word, however outrageous, was somehow more credible than my entire life of integrity. The home that held all my childhood memories, my mother's presence, was suddenly barred to me. The whisper started almost before I'd packed a single bag. Oakhaven was a small town. News, especially scandalous news, traveled faster than a winter wind. Within days, the library board requested a meeting. They spoke of community trust, of the unfortunate cloud now hanging over my name. My employment was terminated. The parents who once smiled and thanked me for recommending books to their children now crossed the street to avoid me. Every glance felt like an accusation, every hushed conversation a condemnation. I tried to speak, to explain, but my words were lost in the cacophony of Brenda's carefully constructed narrative. My name once synonymous with quiet dignity, was now tainted with the stench of deceit. There was nothing left for me in Oakhaven but shame and shadows. The literary cafe, mother's dream fund for me, it all felt like a cruel joke. With a small suitcase and a heart heavier than I ever thought possible, I left. I found a tiny, anonymous apartment in Riverbend, a larger, indifferent city miles away. I got a job in a dusty, second-hand bookstore where no one knew my name or my story. For 10 years, I lived with the weight of that false accusation, a suffocating cloak of undeserved guilt. Brenda had not just stolen an inheritance. She had stolen my life, my past, and almost my future. The bitterness was a constant companion, a cold ember glowing in the pit of my stomach. Riverbend became my self-imposed exile, a city large enough to swallow me whole, its indifference a strange, cold comfort after the suffocating judgment of Oakhaven. I found a measure of anonymity in its bustling streets and nameless faces, but it was an anonymity born of shame, not choice. The second-hand bookstore, the page-turner, with its musty scent of aged paper and forgotten stories, became my sanctuary. Surrounded by the silent companionship of books, I could almost forget I was Charlotte Vance, the accused, the pariah. Almost. The quiet hours spent shelving and cataloging were a pale imitation of the joy I once found in the Oakhaven library, a constant dull ache reminding me of all I had lost. My life shrunk to the confines of my small apartment and the dusty aisles of the store. A monotonous cycle of work, solitary meals, and restless nights. Over those 10 years, the false accusation became more than just a series of events. It burrowed deep into my being, a toxic seed of doubt and self-loathing. Brenda's words, her venomous portrayal of me as a greedy, duplicitous daughter, echoed in the quiet moments. Did a part of me, however small, somehow deserve this? Had I been blind or foolish? I'd replay my mother's final months, searching for a sign I'd missed, a moment I could have acted differently, but there was nothing. Still, the shame clung to me like a second skin. I'd flinch if a stranger looked at me for too long, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest, convinced they somehow knew that my disgrace was written all over my face. Forming new connections felt impossible. How could I let anyone get close when my past was a minefield I dared not let them tread? The few times I tried, a casual acquaintance asking about my family or where I grew up, the words would catch in my throat, and I'd retreat, a polite excuse masking a deep-seated fear of exposure. The ghost of Oakhaven and Brenda's lie haunted every potential friendship, every chance for a normal life. The passage of time did little to dull the sharp edges of my isolation. Holidays were the worst. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Mother's Day. Each one a stark reminder of the family I no longer had, the traditions that had been stolen. I'd see families laughing in the street, their arms full of gifts, and a wave of such profound loneliness would wash over me. It felt like drowning. I'd imagine Brenda in our mother's house, perhaps hosting lavish parties, playing the benevolent matriarch, her life built upon the ruins of mine. The injustice of it would fester, a bitter pill I swallowed daily. Did anyone in Oakhaven ever question her version of events? Did anyone ever spare a thought for me, the sister she had so easily discarded? These questions circled endlessly, offering no solace, only a deeper entrenchment in my sorrow. My dreams were often of Oakhaven, sometimes of happy childhood days, but more frequently, they were nightmarish replays of the accusation, of being chased, of faceless crowds pointing and whispering. Even the memory of my mother, Agnes, became a source of pain rather than comfort. Brenda's accusation had tainted everything, casting a shadow over my relationship with the one person who had loved me unconditionally. How could I honor her? Memory when the world believed I had betrayed her so despicably? Grieving for her felt incomplete, fractured by the lie that stood between us, even in death. I couldn't visit her grave in Oakhaven. The thought of facing the judgmental eyes of the town, of seeing Brenda there, perhaps laying flowers with a show of false piety, was unbearable. So, my grief remained a private, unexpressed ache, another casualty of my sister's greed. I often wondered what Mother would have thought, what she would have done. I clung to the belief that she would have known the truth, that she would never have believed me capable of such a thing. This small, unwavering conviction was one of the few embers that kept a flicker of my true self alive. My days in Riverbend settled into a predictable, anemic rhythm. Work, the solitary walk back to my small apartment, a simple meal eaten alone, and then the long, quiet evenings. I read voraciously, losing myself in other people's stories as an escape from my own. I suppose, in a way, I had become a ghost in my own life, passively accepting the hand I'd been dealt, the fight knocked out of me by the sheer weight of the injustice and the 10 years of carrying it. The vibrant woman who dreamed of a literary cafe had faded, replaced by a quieter, more cautious version of herself, wary of the world and its capacity for cruelty. The fire of indignation had long since dwindled to a dull, persistent ache of resignation. There seemed no way to fight a lie so deeply entrenched, a reputation so thoroughly destroyed. The story Brenda wove was so complete, so convincing in its malicious detail, that it left no room for doubt in the minds of most. I heard, through a rare, hesitant phone call from a distant cousin years ago, that Brenda had even produced evidence, carefully doctored bank slips, a tearful, fabricated account of my supposed pleas for money before Mother's passing. She had played the victim beautifully, the devoted daughter forced to expose her wayward sister to protect their mother's legacy. The cousin had called not out of support, but out of a morbid curiosity, her tone tinged with the same pitying disapproval I'd grown accustomed to. It was clear then that Brenda had not only thrown me out, she had systematically erased the real Charlotte Vance from Oakhaven's collective memory, replacing her with a convenient villain. This, then, was the landscape of my existence for a decade. A life lived in the shadows, haunted by a lie, a slow erosion of spirit. Each morning, I'd put on a brave face, a mask of quiet composure for the few customers at the Page Turner. But underneath, the wound remained, unhealed and festering. The isolation was more than physical. It was a profound severing from my own history, my own truth. I had, to all intents and purposes, ceased to truly live, existing instead in a kind of emotional purgatory, waiting for an end that never seemed to arrive. The world kept spinning, people moved on, but I was stuck, frozen in the moment of that devastating betrayal, the echoes of my sister's accusation, the relentless soundtrack to my ruined life. Another year in Riverbend was drawing to a close, the approaching holidays casting their usual long shadow over my solitary existence. I was in my small apartment, engaged in the melancholic ritual of sifting through the few boxes of Mother Agnes's belongings I'd managed to salvage before Brenda had me barred from the house. They were meager treasures, a few faded photographs, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet, a chipped teacup. Mostly, they just sat there, gathering dust, too painful to look at, yet too precious to discard. This time, however, as I delved deeper into a box I hadn't opened in years, my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. A small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, secured with a brittle clasp. It was Mother's diary. I hadn't even known she kept one regularly. My heart gave a small, unexpected thump. With trembling hands, I unfastened the clasp. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, elegant loops and firm strokes, a script I knew as well as my own. I hesitated, a wave of guilt washing over me. It felt like an intrusion, a violation of her privacy, even now. But a stronger pull, a desperate yearning to connect with her, to hear her voice in some form, urged me on. I settled into my worn armchair, the dim light of the table lamp casting a small circle around me, and began to read. The early entries were mundane, notes about her garden, comments on the weather, a recipe she wanted to try. I smiled faintly, recognizing her quiet observations, her gentle spirit. It was like having her in the room with me for a fleeting moment. Then, as I turned the pages, moving closer to the months before her passing, the tone began to subtly shift. There were entries expressing a growing unease, a worry she couldn't quite articulate. She wrote about Brenda's increasingly frequent requests for money, her extravagant spending habits that seemed to outstrip her modest income as a part-time art consultant. Mother mentioned a significant loan she had given Brenda to cover some urgent debts. Debts Brenda had been vague and evasive about. Brenda assures me it's all under control, one entry read. But I can't shake this feeling of disquiet. She seems so stressed, so unlike herself. My breath caught. This was a side of Brenda's financial life Mother had never discussed with me, and certainly Brenda had never mentioned needing such a large sum. The most jarring entry came a few weeks before Mother fell ill for the last time. She wrote, "Had a rather distressing discussion with Brenda today. She spoke of needing to secure her future, of investments and opportunities. She brought papers, complex documents I didn't fully understand, and asked me to sign them. Said it was just a formality, a way to help her structure her finances more efficiently, using some of the family assets before they were tied up in probate. I felt pressured, confused. Mark Jenkins, her new financial advisor, was there too, a rather slick young man. I signed, mostly to appease her, but a part of me feels uneasy. I pray I've done the right thing. Mark Jenkins." The name was unfamiliar, yet it lodged in my mind like a splinter. Brenda had never mentioned a financial advisor, especially not one involved with Mother's affairs. And the idea of Mother signing complex financial documents she didn't understand, under pressure, it sent a chill down my spine. I read and reread those pages, the words blurring through a sudden mist of tears. This wasn't just a mother's diary. It was a chronicle of her anxieties, her hidden worries about the very daughter who would later accuse me of financial impropriety. The irony was a bitter pill. For 10 years, I had carried the shame, believing Brenda's narrative of my supposed greed. But here, in Mother's own hand, was a different story. A story of Brenda's financial pressures, of secret loans, of a mysterious advisor, and of Mother's own unease. It wasn't concrete proof of my innocence, not yet, but it was a crack in the solid wall of Brenda's deception, the first glimmer of light in a decade of darkness. A forgotten diary, tucked away in a dusty box, had whispered a truth I'd almost given up on. The entries didn't absolve me in the eyes of the world, but they began to absolve me in my own. The self-blame, the gnawing doubt that perhaps I had been negligent or blind, started to recede. Mother had been worried about Brenda, not me. She had been manipulated, not by me, but potentially by her other daughter. A new feeling began to stir within me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just sorrow, but a slow-burning anger, a nascent sense of indignation that was less about my own suffering and more about the deception perpetrated against my mother. She had been a kind, trusting woman, and it seemed her kindness had been exploited. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay awake, Mother's words replaying in my mind, the name Mark Jenkins echoing. The weariness that had been my constant companion for 10 years was still there, but now it was mingled with a restless energy. The passivity that had defined my exile began to feel wrong. For a decade, I had accepted my fate, lived as a ghost. But Mother's diary had breathed a spark into a long-dormant ember. It wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about honoring Agnes's memory, about uncovering the truth she herself had been on the verge of suspecting. A tiny, fragile seed of resolve began to take root in the barren soil of my despair. Perhaps the story wasn't over. Perhaps, after all this time, there was still a chapter left to write. The discovery of Mother Agnes's diary was like a stone dropped into the still, stagnant pool of my life. The ripples spread slowly, unsettling the quiet resignation I had cultivated. For weeks, I reread those particular entries, dissecting every word, every nuance. The name Mark Jenkins became a focal point, a shadowy figure whose presence hinted at a deeper, more complex deception than I had ever imagined. Yet, even with this new, unsettling knowledge, the path forward remained obscure. What could I, a disgraced former librarian living in obscurity, possibly do against Brenda, who by all accounts had solidified her position as Oakhaven's grieving, benevolent heiress? The thought of confronting her, of trying to unravel a 10-year-old lie, felt monumental, almost impossible. The old weariness threatened to pull me back under. Then came the email. It was from a distant cousin, one of the few Oakhaven connections I hadn't completely severed, though our contact was sporadic and usually consisted of brief, impersonal holiday greetings. This email, however, contained a link to the Oakhaven local news website. The subject line read, "Thought you might or might not want to see this." My heart gave a familiar lurch of apprehension. I clicked the link, and a brightly colored banner filled my screen. The Agnes Vance Memorial Charity Gala, a decade of giving. There was a picture of Brenda, smiling serenely, standing on the porch of our old family home, a picture of community, spirit, and philanthropic grace. The article detailed her plans for a lavish fundraising event to be held at the Vance estate, celebrating 10 years of honoring her beloved mother's charitable legacy. I read the article, my blood slowly turning, to ice, then to fire. Every word was a calculated affront. A decade of giving, it proclaimed. A decade since she had systematically destroyed my life and stolen my inheritance. Honoring her beloved mother's legacy. The same mother whose anxieties about Brenda's financial dealings were now laid bare in the pages of her private diary. Brenda, draped in her false piety, was planning to use our mother's memory, our family home, as a stage for her own aggrandizement, a grand performance of her supposed virtue. The sheer, unmitigated hypocrisy of it struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about the money anymore, or even my ruined reputation. It was about the desecration of Agnes's true legacy of kindness and integrity. The image of Brenda, beaming from the steps of the house that should have been partly mine, the house where I'd last seen my mother alive, ignited something within me. The years of suppressed anger, of quiet suffering, coalesced into a single white-hot point of clarity. Enough. Enough of her lies, enough of her charade, enough of my silent acquiescence. She was not going to stand there, bathed in the adulation of a deceived community, and further tarnish our mother's name with her sanctimonious performance. The ghost of Charlotte Vance, the timid, broken woman who had hidden in Riverbend for a decade, began to recede, and in her place a different woman started to emerge. One who was tired, yes, but also profoundly, deeply angry. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The image of the gala, of Brenda's triumphant smile, was seared into my mind. The literary cafe, Mother's dream fund for me, the life I might have had. It all came rushing back, not as a source of wistful regret, but as fuel. For 10 years, I had allowed her to control the narrative, to define me. No more. The fear that had held me captive for so long was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But now it was overshadowed by a fierce protective rage. Protective of my mother's true memory, and protective of the last vestiges of my own dignity. The question was no longer if I could do anything, but what I would do. A plan, vague and unformed at first, began to take shape. The gala. Brenda was providing the stage, the audience, the perfect opportunity for the truth to finally be heard. It was a terrifying prospect, stepping back into Oakhaven, confronting not just Brenda, but the entire town that had condemned me. But the alternative, to do nothing, to let her continue her charade unchallenged, to let Mother's diary remain a secret comfort only to me, was suddenly unbearable. The diary entries, combined with the brazenness of Brenda's gala, had pushed me past my breaking point. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back was older, lines etched around her eyes from years of worry and unshed tears. But there was something else there too, a flicker in the depths of her gaze that hadn't been there before, a spark of resolve, a glint of steel. The decision was made. I would go back to Oakhaven. I would find out more about Mark Jenkins. I would find a way to uncover the full extent of Brenda's betrayal. And if I could, I would use her own meticulously planned celebration to unmask her. The thought sent a shiver of both fear and a strange, exhilarating anticipation through me. The long, dormant fight for my name, for my mother's honor, had finally begun. The decision to return to Oakhaven, once made, settled in my heart with a heavy yet resolute finality. Riverbend, with its comforting anonymity, suddenly felt like a cage. A few days later, I requested a week's leave from Mr. Henderson at the Page-Turner, offering a vague excuse about needing to attend to some old family matters. He grunted his assent, barely looking up from his ledgers, a small mercy for which I was grateful. I packed a small, nondescript bag, the contents practical, my resolve a more significant, though invisible, addition. The bus ride back to Oakhaven was a journey through a landscape of painful memories. Each familiar landmark, each passing signpost, tightened the knot of anxiety in my stomach, but it also firmed my purpose. I was no longer fleeing. I was returning, armed with a sliver of truth and a desperate hope for more. My first stop wasn't the old family home. The thought of seeing it, knowing Brenda was inside, was still too much to bear. Instead, I checked into a small, out-of-the-way motel on the outskirts of town, a place where I was unlikely to be recognized. From this anonymous base, I planned my first tentative steps. The name from Mother's diary, Mark Jenkins, was my primary lead, but before I dived into that, I felt I needed to gauge the atmosphere, to see if anyone in a position of authority might be, if not sympathetic, then at least willing to listen without immediate judgment. My thoughts turned to Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer who had overseen the will reading, the man who had passively watched Brenda expel me. Perhaps with the passage of 10 years, he might have a different perspective, or at least be willing, to answer some questions about the estate's handling. The next morning, I walked into Thompson & Associates, the brass plate on the door as gleaming as it had been a decade ago. Mr. Thompson himself, now considerably grayer and more stooped, looked up in mild surprise as I was shown into his office. Recognition flickered in his eyes, quickly followed by an expression of distinct discomfort. I kept my voice calm and even, explaining I had some questions regarding my mother's estate, specifically about certain financial transactions prior to her death. His demeanor was instantly guarded. He shuffled papers, avoided direct eye contact, and offered vague, unhelpful answers. He said the estate was long settled, that all documents were in order as far as he was concerned, and that he really couldn't recall specific details from so long ago. When I pressed, Mentioning my mother's concerns about certain financial pressures Brenda was under, he became even more evasive, almost agitated, murmuring about client confidentiality and the impropriety of discussing one sibling's affairs with another, especially given the unfortunate circumstances of our last meeting. It was clear he wanted me out of his office as quickly as possible. He was a wall, impenetrable and unhelpful, and I left feeling frustrated, but also more convinced that there was something he, or Brenda, didn't want scrutinized. His discomfort was almost as telling as any admission. Discouraged but not defeated, I walked through Oak Haven's familiar streets, a ghost in my own hometown. The town square, the bakery where Mother used to buy her favorite rye bread, the park where I'd played as a child, each sight was a fresh stab of grief and loss. As I neared the old neighborhood, I saw a familiar figure tending roses in a front garden. It was Mrs. Peterson, our former next-door neighbor, a woman known for her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, but also for a fundamental sense of fairness. She had always been kind to Mother, and, if I remembered correctly, had never been particularly fond of Brenda's more flamboyant ways. Taking a deep breath, I opened her garden gate. She looked up, her brow furrowed in concentration as she pruned a wayward stem. When she saw me, her eyes widened, first in surprise, then with a dawning recognition that held no judgment, only a kind of weary understanding. "Charlotte Vance," she said, her voice a little raspier than I remembered, but still firm. "I'll be. I wondered what became of you." She put down her shears and invited me in for tea. Sitting in her sun-drenched kitchen, so much like I remembered, a fragile sense of hope began to bloom. I told her, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence about Mother's diary, about my suspicions concerning Brenda and the missing inheritance. Mrs. Peterson listened intently, nodding occasionally, her gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I never did believe Brenda's story, not entirely. It never sat right, you being painted as a thief. You were always a good girl, Charlotte, devoted to your mother." Her words were like a balm to a wound I hadn't realized was still so raw. She then confirmed something that made my pulse quicken. "You know," she mused, "speaking of people who didn't sit right, Brenda started having a visitor a few months before your mother passed. A slick-looking fellow in a fancy suit, always carrying a briefcase. Came by several times when Agnes was napping or out. I asked Brenda once who he was, just being neighborly, you know. She got all flustered and said he was a financial consultant, helping her with some investments. Said his name was Jenkins, I think. Mark Jenkins." There it was again. Mrs. Peterson, with her keen neighborhood watch, had seen him. She couldn't offer documents or proof, but her eyewitness account placed him directly in contact with Brenda at our mother's house in those crucial months. It was the first independent corroboration of the name in Mother's diary, a vital piece connecting Brenda to this mysterious figure. Mrs. Peterson's sharp memory and willingness to speak after Mr. Thompson's deliberate evasiveness felt like the first real break in the case I was slowly, painstakingly trying to build. Mrs. Peterson's confirmation of Mark Jenkins's presence, his clandestine meetings with Brenda at our mother's home, was the spark I desperately needed. It transformed him from a shadowy name in a diary into a tangible link in the chain of deception. She didn't know much more about him, only that he'd stopped coming around shortly after Mother Agnes passed, around the same time Brenda began her public lamentations about my supposed thievery. But that was enough. Armed with his name and Mrs. Peterson's quiet encouragement to not let that sister of yours get away with it, I returned to my motel room with a renewed, albeit anxious, sense of purpose. The internet, a tool largely unavailable in its current, pervasive form when the accusations first flew, was now my primary avenue of investigation. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my determined face in the dim room. Searching for Mark Jenkins' financial advisor Oakhaven yielded little, which wasn't surprising if he was as discreet as Brenda likely wanted. I broadened my search, trying variations, adding terms like consultant, estate planning. Then, on a whim, I added fraud and scam to his name. The results were still sparse, but one small archived news article from a regional business journal, nearly 8 years old, caught my eye. It detailed a minor investigation into a Mark J. Jenkins for questionable investment practices and misrepresentation of financial products in a neighboring county. There was no conviction mentioned, just a settlement and a censure from a regulatory body. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it painted a picture of a man operating in the gray areas of legality, someone capable of exploiting loopholes and vulnerable individuals. The description of his methods, charming, persuasive, preying on those unfamiliar with complex financial jargon, sent a shiver of recognition down my spine. It sounded exactly like the kind of person who could have manipulated Mother, or at least provided Brenda with the tools to do so. The article mentioned the town where Jenkins had last been known to operate. It was a long shot, but I decided to search for any current business listings for him there or in surrounding areas. Most searches led to dead ends. It seemed Mark Jenkins had become adept at disappearing or, at the very least, maintaining a low profile after his brush with regulatory trouble. Frustration began to creep in. I had a name, a possible pattern of behavior, but nothing concrete linking him directly to Brenda's scheme beyond Mother's diary entry and Mrs. Peterson's sighting. I felt like I was chasing a ghost. I leaned back, rubbing my tired eyes, the weight of the task pressing down on me. How could I prove anything after all this time, with so little to go on? It was then, in that moment of near despair, that another fragment from Mother's diary surfaced in my memory with sudden clarity. She spoke of needing to secure her future, a way to help her structure her finances more efficiently using some of the family assets before they were tied up in probate. Before probate. That was key. And then the other phrase, the secret financial agreement Mother had mentioned earlier in the diary, the one she'd made to help Brenda with her urgent debts. Could these two things be connected? Could Brenda have used that initial, perhaps, legitimate agreement as a springboard, a cover, to entangle Mother in something far more extensive and nefarious with Jenkins's help? The idea hit me with force. What if Brenda hadn't just stolen readily available cash and jewelry after Mother's death, but had, with Jenkins's expertise, manipulated Mother into signing away control of assets before she died, making them appear to disappear legally, or at least be untraceable to Brenda directly after the fact? This new theory re-energized my search. I wasn't just looking for theft anymore. I was looking for a sophisticated, premeditated fraud, orchestrated under the guise of financial planning. I started thinking about the types of documents Mother might have signed: powers of attorney, trust agreements, deeds of transfer. These would likely be lodged with county registries or specific financial institutions, not necessarily in Mr. Thompson's general estate files, especially if Brenda and Jenkins wanted to keep them discreet. My next step, I realized, wouldn't be chasing Jenkins directly, but trying to find the paper trail he and Brenda might have created, a trail that perhaps began with that secret financial agreement Mother had so innocently mentioned. I remembered Mrs. Peterson mentioning she had a nephew, young Tom, who worked in the county records office. She'd said he was a good lad, always willing to help an old bird like me. It was a tenuous connection, but right then, it felt like a lifeline. If Brenda had manipulated Mother into signing over property or significant assets before her death, there would have to be a record somewhere, a deed transfer, a change in ownership filed with the county. The thought that Brenda might have been so brazen as to transfer assets into her own name, or a company controlled by Jenkins, even while Mother was alive, under the guise of that financial structuring, made me feel sick. But it also made a chilling kind of sense. It would explain how so much could vanish so completely, so quickly, leaving me to take the fall for a crime that was far more calculated and insidious than simple opportunistic theft. The true nature of Brenda's villainy, and the potential scale of her betrayal, was beginning to emerge from the shadows, more monstrous than I had dared to imagine. The realization that Brenda's scheme might have involved legally manipulating Mother Agnes into signing away assets before her death shifted my entire perspective. It wasn't just about proving I didn't steal, it was about proving Brenda did through calculated deception. Mrs. Peterson, when I shared my new theory and the potential significance of county records, listened with grim satisfaction. "That sounds exactly like something that conniving girl would cook up," she declared. Her eyes narrowed. "Get your mother to sign things away all legal-like, then cry poor and point the finger at you. Diabolical." She immediately offered to speak to her nephew, Tom, at the county records office. "He's a stickler for rules," she warned, "but he's got a soft spot for his old auntie, and he always did like your mother." A few anxious days passed. I continued my online research into Mark Jenkins, trying to find any more recent traces of his activities, but he remained elusive. My focus, however, had firmly shifted to the potential paper trail. Then, Mrs. Peterson called, her voice crackling with suppressed excitement. "Tom found something, Charlotte," she said. "It took some digging, and he had to be very discreet. But he found it. A quitclaim deed, signed by Agnes Vance, transferring ownership of the Oakhaven family home solely to Brenda Vance. Dated 3 months before your mother passed away." My breath hitched. The house, the one asset Brenda couldn't have easily liquidated or hidden, she had simply had Mother sign it over to her. "And guess who notarized the signature, Charlotte?" Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "A Mark J. Jenkins." The pieces slammed into place with a sickening thud. The financial structuring Mother had mentioned, the papers she'd signed under pressure from Brenda and Jenkins. This was it. Brenda hadn't waited for Mother to die. She had secured the most valuable asset for herself while Agnes was still alive, likely weak and easily confused. And Jenkins had been the facilitator, the official witness to this egregious act of filial betrayal. This deed was the cornerstone of Brenda's entire plan. By having the house in her name before probate, it would never have been part of the divisible estate, making its disappearance from the inheritance perfectly legal on the surface, while she could simultaneously accuse me of pilfering the more liquid assets to complete her narrative of my greed. It was cold, calculated, and utterly heartless. "Tom managed to get me a certified copy," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice lowering conspiratorially. "He said it felt wrong, what he saw. He remembered your mother, too." This document, this single piece of paper, was more powerful than 1,000 accusations. It was concrete proof of Brenda's premeditation, of her manipulation of our ailing mother, all facilitated by the shady Mark Jenkins. My hands were shaking as I held the copy Mrs. Peterson later brought to my motel. The sight of Mother's familiar, albeit slightly wavering signature on such a devastating document, beside the florid scrawl of Mark Jenkins, filled me with a fresh wave of grief and fury. With this crucial evidence in hand, the charity gala, Brenda's monument to her own hypocrisy, transformed in my mind from a terrifying prospect into the perfect stage. My plan began to solidify. I wouldn't just stand up and make accusations. I would present undeniable proof. I envisioned it, clearly, Brenda basking in the spotlight, delivering her saccharine speech about family legacy. And then, the interruption. Not a hysterical outburst, but a calm, factual dismantling of her lies, backed by the very documents she thought would protect her. Mrs. Peterson, bless her feisty heart, was fully on board. "We'll need to get you in there without her seeing you beforehand," she mused, already strategizing. "And we'll need a way to project this deed, nice and big, for everyone to see. Let them witness her treachery with their own eyes." We spent the next few days meticulously planning. Mrs. Peterson, with her network of old Oak Haven acquaintances, managed to secure 2 tickets to the gala through a friend who was on one of the organizing committees, but harbored her own quiet reservations about Brenda's sudden philanthropic zeal. The bigger challenge was how to display the document. I couldn't rely on Brenda's goodwill to let me use her audiovisual equipment. I researched portable projectors, small enough to be discreetly carried in a handbag, and found one I could order for next-day delivery to a pickup point near Oak Haven. The risk was enormous. If we were caught, if Brenda got wind of my presence or my intentions, she could easily have me removed, even arrested for trespassing or causing a disturbance. But the thought of exposing her, of finally reclaiming the truth in front of the very community that had shunned me, was a powerful motivator, eclipsing the fear. The stage was nearly set for a different kind of performance at the Agnes Vance Memorial Charity Gala, one where the star would be the unvarnished, damning truth. The evening of the Agnes Vance Memorial Charity Gala arrived with a heavy, charged atmosphere, at least for me and Mrs. Peterson. Oak Haven was abuzz. Cars lined the streets leading to our old family home, their occupants dressed in their finest, ready for an evening of ostentatious charity. My nerves were a tangled knot, a volatile mix of trepidation and a steely resolve that surprised even myself. Mrs. Peterson, on the other hand, seemed to be relishing the impending drama, her eyes sparkling with a militant excitement that was surprisingly infectious. "Chin up, Charlotte," she said, patting my arm as we prepared to leave her small, cozy house, where I'd subtly relocated from the motel. "Tonight the chickens come home to roost, and Brenda's the prize hen." We'd chosen our outfits carefully, elegant but understated, designed to blend in rather than stand out. My portable projector, small but powerful, was nestled in my evening bag, along with the certified copy of the quitclaim deed and a USB drive containing a scanned image of it. Mrs. Peterson carried a formidable-looking clutch that, she winked, contained essentials. Our tickets, thankfully, got us through the main entrance without a hitch, though every welcoming smile from a greeter felt like a potential point of exposure. The house, my mother's house, was almost unrecognizable, transformed by opulent floral arrangements, glittering lights, and the throng of Oak Haven's elite. The air hummed with conversations, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. It was a far cry from the warm, loving home I remembered. Brenda was, of course, the radiant center of it all. I caught glimpses of her across the crowded main hall, holding court, her laughter a little too loud, her gestures a little too grand. She was dressed in a shimmering gown, dripping with jewelry, some of which I suspected with a pang might have once belonged to our mother. Each sight of her, so confident and self-congratulatory, fueled the cold fire in my belly. Our immediate goal was to locate the audiovisual setup. We'd scouted the layout from old real estate photos and guessed it would be near the makeshift stage erected in the large drawing room where the speeches were scheduled to take place. We moved through the crowd, trying to appear casual, 2 anonymous guests enjoying the festivities. The first near miss came as we neared the drawing room. Brenda, moving from one group of admirers to another, turned suddenly, her gaze sweeping the room. My heart leaped into my throat. I instinctively ducked behind a large potted palm, pulling Mrs. Peterson with me. We stood there, hearts pounding, hidden by the fronds, as Brenda passed by, oblivious, her attention captured by the mayor who had just arrived. "Too close," Mrs. Peterson whispered, fanning herself with her program. That woman has eyes like a hawk when she's on show. We waited a few more minutes before daring to venture out again. The audiovisual equipment was, as we'd hoped, situated on a small table to the side of the stage, partially concealed by a velvet curtain. A young technician was busy making adjustments. This was the trickiest part of the plan. We needed a distraction, a window of opportunity for me to quickly connect my projector, or, at the very least, swap the USB drive in their system if it was compatible. Mrs. Peterson, true to her word, rose to the occasion. With the practiced air of a slightly befuddled but demanding grande dame, she approached a nearby waiter carrying a tray of canapés. "Young man," she declared, her voice carrying just enough to cause a minor stir. "These hors d'oeuvres are simply divine, but I seem to have misplaced my reading glasses. Could you possibly help an old woman identify this delightful morsel? Is it salmon or some exotic pâté?" As the waiter, flustered by her directness, leaned in to inspect the canapés, and a few curious onlookers turned their attention to the small commotion, Mrs. Peterson, accidentally, bumped the waiter's arm. The tray wobbled precariously, canapés scattering across the polished floor. "Oh, dear me! How terribly clumsy!" she exclaimed, feigning distress, effectively drawing the attention of the technician and several other nearby guests. In that brief, chaotic moment, under the cover of the ensuing cleanup and apologies, I slipped behind the curtain. My hands were shaking, but I moved with a desperate efficiency. Their system was a laptop connected to a large projector. My own projector would be too obvious to set up. Plan B, the USB. With a silent prayer, I ejected their prepared presentation stick and inserted my own. The file copied in seconds. I then reinserted their stick, hoping the brief swap would go unnoticed. I was back at Mrs. Peterson's side, trying to look nonchalant, just as the last of the canapés were being cleared away, my heart hammering against my ribs. The technician, after a cursory glance at his screen, seemed none the wiser. We found seats towards the back, offering a good view of the stage and, crucially, the large screen behind it where presentations would be displayed. The speeches began. The mayor, the head of a local charity Brenda was supporting, all praising her generosity, her dedication to Agnes Vance's memory. Each word of praise felt like a personal insult. I clutched my evening bag, the weight of the original deed, inside a small comfort. My moment was approaching. Brenda was next. She glided onto the stage, met with enthusiastic applause, her smile wide and beatific. She began her speech, her voice smooth and practiced, filled with touching anecdotes about Mother, her commitment to community, her profound sense of family. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I took a deep, steadying breath. The USB drive was in their system. The trap was set. All that remained was to spring it. Brenda stood at the podium, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, the very picture of bereaved benevolent grace. Her voice, honeyed and smooth, filled the drawing room, weaving a tapestry of loving reminiscences about our mother, Agnes. She spoke of Mother's kindness, her quiet charity, her deep love for Oakhaven. "It has been my solemn vow," Brenda intoned, her voice thick with feigned emotion, "to uphold her precious legacy, to continue her work, to ensure her spirit of generosity lives on through this foundation." A smattering of appreciative murmurs rippled through the audience. I watched her, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. The audacity of her performance was almost paralyzing, but beneath the paralysis, the anger was a simmering volcano, ready to erupt. Mrs. Peterson gave my hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. "And so," Brenda continued, her smile widening as she neared her crescendo, "it is with immense pride, and in loving memory of my dearly departed mother, Agnes Vance, that I announce our fundraising goal for this year." This was it. This was my moment. As she paused for dramatic effect, before announcing the figure, I stood up. My legs felt strangely unsteady, but my voice, when it came, was clearer and stronger than I'd expected. Brenda. Just her name, cutting through the expectant hush. Heads turned. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Brenda froze mid-sentence, her smile faltering as she scanned the room, her eyes finally landing on me. For a split second, a look of sheer, unadulterated shock, quickly masked by annoyance, flashed across her face. "Charlotte, what on earth are you doing here? This is a private event." "I'm here to talk about Mother's legacy too, Brenda," I said, my voice gaining strength, projecting across the suddenly silent room. "The real legacy. And the truth about how you've honored it." I held up the small remote for the projector system, the one I'd seen the technician use. "Perhaps we could start with this." With a steady hand, I pressed the button. The large screen behind Brenda, which had been displaying the gala's logo, flickered, and then, stark and undeniable, the scanned image of the quitclaim deed filled the space. Agnes Vance's signature, frail but distinct, transferring her home to Brenda Lowe, notarized by Mark J. Jenkins, 3 months before her death. A collective gasp went through the room. Brenda whirled around, her face paling dramatically as she saw the document looming behind her. "What is this? This is an outrage. Someone stop this," she sputtered, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "That document," I announced, my voice ringing with a certainty I hadn't felt in a decade, "is a quitclaim deed. It shows how my sister, Brenda, had our ailing mother, Agnes Vance, sign over the family home to her, months before Mother passed away. She did this with the help of a discredited financial advisor named Mark Jenkins, effectively removing the most significant asset from Mother's estate before it could be divided, before I could supposedly steal from it." I began to walk slowly towards the stage, the certified copy of the deed held firmly in my hand. "For 10 years, I continued, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces in the audience, many of whom I recognized from my past life in Oakhaven. My sister has told you, and anyone who would listen, that I stole our mother's inheritance. That I was a thief who betrayed my own family. She threw me out of my home, destroyed my reputation, and forced me into exile. But the truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that Brenda systematically planned and executed the theft herself, using manipulation and deceit, while our mother was vulnerable and unwell." "This is slander! Lies!" Brenda shrieked from the stage, her composure shattering, her face contorted with rage and panic. "She's always been jealous. She's trying to ruin this beautiful evening dedicated to our mother." But her denials sounded hollow against the stark evidence projected behind her. "Is it a lie, Brenda?" I challenged, reaching the foot of the stage. "Is Mother's signature a lie? Is Mark Jenkins's notarization a lie? The same Mark Jenkins who has a history of questionable financial practices? The same Mark Jenkins our mother mentioned with unease in her private diary, a diary I found, where she detailed her worries about your spending, your requests for money, your pressure for her to sign documents she didn't understand." The mention of the diary seemed to land another blow. Brenda visibly flinched. The crowd was utterly silent now, a sea of shocked, incredulous faces, all eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. Some were looking at Brenda with dawning horror, others at me with a new, hesitant curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. The carefully constructed facade of Brenda Lowe, Oakhaven's benevolent philanthropist, was crumbling before their very eyes, under the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. I had their attention. I had the proof, and for the first time in a decade, I felt the power of my own voice, speaking a truth that had been silenced for far too long. The silence in the drawing room was thick enough to cut with a knife, broken only by Brenda's ragged breathing from the stage. The quitclaim, deed, stark and damning, still loomed on the screen behind her, a silent testament to her duplicity. Her face, moments before radiant with feigned benevolence, was now a blotchy canvas of fury and dawning panic. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words, a rare state for my usually glib sister. The guests, who had come expecting an evening of polite charity and social maneuvering, were frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a kind of horrified fascination. This was far more drama than any of them had bargained for. Mother's diary also mentions a significant loan she gave you, Brenda, I continued, my voice steady, unwavering, pressing my advantage while she was clearly reeling. To cover urgent? Debts you were evasive about, debts she worried over. Did you ever repay her? Or was that too part of the inheritance you felt entitled to before she even passed? I wasn't shouting. My tone was factual, almost conversational, which somehow made the accusations land with even greater weight. Each question was a precisely aimed dart, deflating her carefully inflated image. Finally, Brenda found her voice, though it was shrill and laced with hysteria. This is a setup. She's a bitter, twisted woman, trying to destroy me because she couldn't manage her own life. Security! Get her out of here! She shrieked, gesturing wildly. A couple of burly security guards, who had been hovering uncertainly near the entrance, began to move hesitantly towards me. But before they could reach me, a prominent voice cut through the tension. It was Mr. Albright, the elderly chairman of the Oak Haven Historical Society, a man universally respected for his integrity. He stood up, his gaze fixed on Brenda. Brenda, he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense authority. Perhaps you'd care to explain this document? This deed? Agnes Vance was a dear friend to many of us. These are serious allegations. His intervention shifted the atmosphere palpably. It was no longer just my word against Brenda's. A man of his standing giving credence to my claims made. Others pause, look again at the evidence on the screen, and then at Brenda, with new, questioning eyes. The mayor, who had earlier been lauding Brenda, now looked deeply uncomfortable, slowly inching away from where she stood on the stage. Other prominent community members who had been schmoozing with Brenda all evening began to murmur amongst themselves, their expressions hardening. The tide was turning, visibly and rapidly. Brenda seemed to shrink under Mr. Albright's steady gaze. Her attempts at bluster faded. It's a misunderstanding, she stammered, her eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. Mother wanted me to have the house. It was an arrangement. Charlotte is twisting everything. But the conviction was gone. She looked less like a wronged victim and more like a cornered animal. Mrs. Peterson, from her seat, let out a distinct and very audible "hump" of disbelief, which drew a few stifled snorts from those nearby. Some guests began to quietly slip out, clearly wanting no part of the escalating scandal. Others remained, rooted to the spot, their eyes wide. I saw a few faces from my past in the crowd, former friends, neighbors who had turned their backs on me 10 years ago. Their expressions were unreadable, a confusing mix of embarrassment, perhaps a dawning shame, and a reluctant reassessment of everything they thought they knew. One woman, a former colleague from the library, met my gaze for a fleeting second, her eyes filled with what looked like regret, before quickly looking away. The charity gala, Brenda's moment of triumph, had imploded. The festive atmosphere had curdled into one of acute awkwardness and public humiliation for its hostess. The security guards had stopped, looking to the mayor for direction, who simply shook his head, clearly washing his hands of the situation. Brenda stood alone on the stage, the projected image of her deceit her only backdrop. The funds she had, hoped to raise for her mother's legacy were forgotten. Her own legacy, in that moment, was being rewritten from one of Oakhaven's darlings to that of a calculating fraud. The silence stretched again, heavy and accusatory, a far more damning judgment than any shouted words could have been. The truth, once unleashed, had a momentum all its own, and it was clear that Brenda's meticulously constructed world was crashing down around her. Watching Brenda crumble on that stage, stripped bare of her pretenses, I felt a strange cocktail of emotions. There was a grim satisfaction, yes, a vindication for the 10 years of silent suffering. But beneath it, there wasn't triumph, not in the exultant way I might have once imagined. Instead, there was a profound sense of weariness and a quiet, somber understanding of the wreckage. 2 lives, 2 sisters, irrevocably fractured by greed and lies. The Charlotte who had meticulously planned this confrontation, who had rehearsed her words, felt herself receding, replaced by someone who was simply tired. Tired of the fight, tired of the pain, but also, for the first time in a decade, starting to feel a lightness, the first stirring of a burden being lifted. As the initial shock in the room began to morph into a low hum of hushed, scandalized conversations, I didn't wait for apologies or explanations from anyone. I had said what I needed to say. The truth was out, stark and undeniable. Mrs. Peterson, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of pride and righteous indignation, came to my side. "Well, my dear," she whispered, her voice brimming with satisfaction, "I'd say that rather took the icing off her cake." I managed a small, tired smile. She took my arm, and together we walked out of that opulent drawing room, leaving behind the shambles of Brenda's reputation and the stunned Oakhaven elite. No one tried to stop us. The path cleared before us as if by an invisible force, guests parting wordlessly, their gazes following me, no longer with condemnation, but with a dawning, uncomfortable respect. Outside, the cool night air felt like a balm on my heated skin. I took a deep breath. The scent of Oakhaven's roses, once a painful reminder, now just a fragrance in the night. The weight that had been crushing my chest for 10 long years seemed to have significantly lessened, not vanished entirely, but no longer unbearable. The woman who had walked into that gala, filled with trepidation and a desperate need for justice, was not the same woman who walked out. That former Charlotte, the one defined by shame and accusation, had been shed somewhere amidst the glittering lights and shattered illusions of Brenda's party. In her place stood someone quieter, perhaps, more scarred certainly, but also undeniably stronger, more whole. I was no longer just Charlotte Vance, the accused. I was Charlotte Vance, the woman who had spoken her truth, who had faced her accuser and reclaimed her name, not with vengeance, but with irrefutable facts. Mrs. Peterson drove me back to her little house in a comfortable silence. There was nothing more to say, really. The deed was done. Later that night, alone in her guest room, I didn't sleep much, but it wasn't the restless, anxiety-ridden insomnia of the past. It was a different kind of wakefulness, a processing of the immense shift that had occurred. The anger that had fueled me for so long was beginning to dissipate, leaving behind a landscape that felt raw but also open, cleared for something new. I didn't feel joy, not yet. The wounds were too deep, the lost years too significant for easy celebration. But I felt a profound sense of release, as if a heavy chain I hadn't even fully realized I was dragging had finally been unlinked. The next morning, news of the gala implosion, as the local online forums were already dubbing it, was undoubtedly spreading like wildfire through Oakhaven and beyond. I imagined the phone lines buzzing, the hushed conversations over coffee, the reevaluation of Brenda, and perhaps of me. I felt no urge to stay and witness it, no desire to seek out those who had wronged me or to accept belated apologies. My purpose in Oak Haven was complete. I had planted the seed of truth. It would grow on its own now. My transformation wasn't about becoming a hero or a martyr. It was about shedding a false identity that had been forced upon me and rediscovering the quiet strength that had always been there, buried deep beneath layers of pain and injustice. I was free, not in a jubilant, unfettered way, but in a more profound internal sense. Free from the lie, free from the shame, and free to finally, truly, begin to heal. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a very long time, it felt like my own. I left Oak Haven the following afternoon, slipping away as quietly as I had arrived. Mrs. Peterson saw me off at the bus station, her hug surprisingly fierce. "Don't you be a stranger, Charlotte," she said, her eyes a little misty. "You've got friends here now, real ones." I promised I wouldn't, and I meant it. Her unwavering belief in me had been a lifeline, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, true decency can shine through. As the bus pulled away, I didn't look back. Oak Haven was my past, a chapter now closed, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of an ending, a difficult story finally told. The journey back to Riverbend was different this time. The landscape, outside the window, didn't seem so bleak, the future not so daunting. The small apartment that had once felt like a prison now seemed like a haven, a place of my own choosing. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving a space that was initially unsettling in its emptiness. The fight that had consumed me for so long was over. Now it was time to simply be. I returned to my job at the page-turner, to the familiar scent of old books and the quiet rhythm of my days. Mr. Henderson, my boss, remarked that I seemed lighter, a small observation that meant the world. News from Oak Haven trickled in, mostly through Mrs. Peterson. Brenda's downfall had been swift and public. The charity gala was her social undoing. Investigations were launched, not just into the quitclaim deed, but into her handling of Mother's estate overall. Mark Jenkins, it turned out, had a string of similarly creative financial arrangements with other vulnerable individuals, and my exposure of his Oak Haven activities contributed to a larger case being built against him. Brenda faced legal repercussions, though the full extent took time to unfold. More immediately, she faced the ostracism of the community she had so desperately courted. Her carefully constructed world had, as Mrs. Peterson colorfully put it, gone up in a puff of expensive smoke. I felt no joy in her ruin, only a profound sense of the inevitable consequences of her choices. Justice, in its own way, was being served. For me, the path forward wasn't about reclaiming what was lost in Oak Haven, not in a material sense. The money, the house, they were tainted, symbols of pain and betrayal. My inheritance, I realized, was something far more valuable. The truth, my reclaimed dignity, and the resilience I'd discovered within myself. I started, slowly at first, to reconnect with the world. I accepted a dinner invitation from a fellow book lover I'd met at the store. I even began sketching out ideas, tentative at first, for that little literary cafe Mother Agnes and I had dreamed about. Not in Oak Haven, but here, in Riverbend, on my own terms. A quiet testament to survival and the enduring power of a dream. It wouldn't be grand, but it would be mine, built on honesty and a love for stories, much like the one I had finally been able to tell. Life rarely offers neat resolutions, and the scars of those 10 years would always be a part of me. But they no longer defined me. The bitterness had largely faded, replaced by a quiet strength, a deeper understanding of human nature, both its capacity for cruelty and its potential for kindness. I learned that sometimes the quietest voices hold the most powerful truths, and that fighting for that truth, even when the odds seem insurmountable, is a battle worth waging. It's a slow process, healing from such a profound betrayal. A journey. Many of us walk in different ways, wouldn't you agree? Finding your voice after being silenced for so long is perhaps one of life's most challenging, yet ultimately rewarding, undertakings. My story is not one of grand vengeance, but of a quiet, determined reclamation. I didn't set out to destroy my sister, only to uncover the truth she tried so hard to bury. And in doing so, I found something I thought I'd lost forever: myself. Charlotte Vance, no longer the accused, no longer the victim, but simply Charlotte, a woman who had faced the storm and found, on the other side, the quiet promise of a new dawn. And that, I realized, was the most profound justice of all.